All right. Good evening, guys. Ken at Tortoise Capital. This is the nightly strategy podcast for July 16th, 2020. So today turned out to be a day to think about coaching. My, trading and business mentor, Bob, is he in here tonight? He and I have been looking at different coaching strategies for businesses and whatnot. And Bob is a money manager out in Colorado. And a lot of his clients are business executives. And so he started a podcast where he interviews, business leaders, strategic leaders about what they do and how they do it. And so we're just we generally both think like businessmen, but it just happens that we're, managing money and trading. But that's the same mentality that we bring to trading is the same mentality that businessmen bring. So there's a nice synergy in there. So we were both listening to a couple different guys that offer coaching advice and strategies, and we're thinking our way through it and whatnot. So coaching was kind of on my mind. Coaching is on my mind also because our 3-star general got a new leader. He's in charge of all Army schools, and his annual training guidance to us was to think about how to turn our leadership instruction into preparation for our students to go develop Army leaders, as opposed to what it had been, which was a survey course for leadership ideas and skills for organizational leaders. So that's more of a technical approach, but our new 3-star is kind of a man of the people, an old infantryman, and he wants us to have more of a direct effect on the leadership development at the unit level, at the squad, platoon, company, and battalion level, down at where wars are fought and won or lost. So a much more immediate focus and applications focus. So what that means for us, in my view, and the position I've been taking with our leadership who are designing curriculum and all that, is that our college needs to be a teaching college. That when we're teaching these guys how to develop their subordinate leaders after graduation, they go back to units and they become leaders and commanders, and then they have to develop those young leaders. So if we want to teach them how to do that teaching them how to be a coach turns out to be a pretty powerful leverage, which means that we need to coach them about being a coach, which means that our faculty has to develop the skills of a coach and not just of a lecturer on the stage. A lecturer on the stage is only concerned about saying it correctly so that when it leaves your mouth, it's correct. And you're kind of not worried about what happens on the other end, because it's the student's job to internalize that, then take a test, and then pass the test to show that they're thinking the way the teacher wants them to think. That's the old school of traditional lecture built on the old university model, sage on the stage. What the 3-star general is challenging us to do is the same thing that leaders of craft knowledge throughout the centuries have been doing, and that is, how do I ensure that I can transfer the skillful knowledge that I've developed to the next generation of artists and craftsmen so that they can be better than me? And so now it's not what you send, it's what sticks. So one of the ways that you can think in that way is to adopt the strategy of coaching. So a coach is designed to help the player develop their skills to the highest possible level. And so I'm trying to help our college think through the implications of his challenge to us, to say that what we've got to do is we have to become coaches of our students, and then require them to demonstrate that they can coach while they're here in the safe environment of the university. So if they can demonstrate the ability to coach here, then we know that they can deliver that same skill set when they get to the unit. So it's not enough to talk to them about it. It's not enough to even be a good coach of them. We have to put them in a position where they have to demonstrate the ability to coach. So who could a student coach? Well, a student could coach themselves. They could coach their peers. They could demonstrate the coaching of others in the classroom. They could actually perform coaching functions on the faculty, because as the faculty is trying to deliver good coaching technique, being good demonstrators of technique, we could actually ask these students to evaluate the way that we are coaching them according to our coaching model. Am I coaching you the way we say that coaching should be done? And then you can give me feedback on how well I'm coaching. So now what we're actually in the position of is this diagram in the middle, which says there's a dynamic relationship now. This infinite symbol is like an infinite energy. There is a cyclic relationship now between the coach and the player, where the coach gives instructions and the player gives feedback through their performance, and then the coach gives feedback about the performance. But the player can also give feedback to the coach about how the coach is coaching. So when both of the people in this relationship, the coach and the player, treat the endeavor as co-creation, that what we're trying to do is raise our skill levels on the team, now the coach and the player have a mutually supportive, reinforcing relationship where the coach helps the player become the best player they can be, and then the player can help the coach become the best coach they can be. For that to happen, each of the people in that relationship have to have the attitude, habits, and intention. They have to put in the work to be able to give and receive constructive feedback. So there's not just the intention, but there's also the communication. Well, we're not just talking about, doing the laundry here. It's coaching and playing about something. So there is some game that we're playing, and there is an art and a science of every interesting game. And there are certain measurables that are part of that game that are easy to focus on and around which you can build skillful behavior. So there is some relationship between the nature of the game and the things you can measure and the skills you perform, and then your communication about those skills. And then there's the habits that we bring in to make practice perfect. And the way we practice matters. And then the feedback and communication skills we give each other enables each one to become better at what they're doing as a consequence of the quality of that relationship. If it sounds like I've said this before, I have said it before. In fact, the last time I said this was at soccer practice 90 minutes ago to my high school girls team, because I handed them out their smart cards, and we were taking a look at how a coach looks at players, and I was suggesting to them how players should look at coaches and how we can both look at the game. So we started talking about the essential elements of the game we play, soccer, and the most important measurables and skills. And I spent today's practice teaching them how to see through the eyes of a coach and how they were playing. And I was helping them understand that the feedback that I'm giving them is based on how I see them playing and performing, and then the method and the mode and the style of the feedback is designed to help them improve their play. It's not to judge them as good or bad people or anything like that. It's simply how to improve their skills in the measurable areas in the art and the science of the game based on how I see the game and how I see them performing. Well, it's not enough just to see the game in a certain way, but then the communication of of that information is there's a certain knowledge about how to say it. And then all of this, how to see the game through the eyes of the coach, how to play the game from the eyes of the player, how to talk about it in a meaningful way that improves their performance and makes it clear about what we're trying to do, is all aimed towards the goals that we're sharing and the path that we've mapped out for continuous improvement. And so the most important discussion I had with them tonight was to think about these questions here. If I'm a coach, I can ask the question of a coach, who do you want to coach? And if I wrote that in the form of a job description, I could describe the kinds of players that I want to apply to be coached by me. If I'm a coach that has a choice about who I decide to coach, if I get to be selective about that, and I do, well, I can define the kind of player that it is that I am really interested in coaching. And if I tell them that and they want to be coached by me, then they know what it is that I want them to be and aim towards. So thinking about answering that question, who do you want to coach, by describing the job description, the qualities of the ideal player. That's no different than saying, hey, I want to hire somebody for my business, and these are the things that I want them to possess, the knowledge, skills, habits, and attributes of what it is that I want them to be. So a coach can say, this is the kind of player that I'm looking for. And the reason I'm looking for that kind of player is because that kind of player ends up developing the skills to play the game beautifully and to get the most out of their potential and to become a good teammate. So we talked about why a coach should think about what kind of players they want to attract and what kinds of players they will not accept, because you get a choice. And I said, well, if a coach gets to ask that question and to write a job description for players, most importantly, Dem, I said, you guys as players, who do you want to be coached by? What kind of a coach do you really want to have? If you think, do you want one who lets you get away with murder and doesn't push you and doesn't hold you to account and lets players run amok? Is that really the kind of coach that you want to have, really? So I gave them some homework today. Our next practice is Monday. Their homework is to answer those two questions, to come in writing with a little essay that says, if you were a coach, what kind of a player would you want? And if you're a player, what kind of a coach do you want me to be? And then I'm going to ask them to measure themselves against what they defined as the kind of player that they think a coach would want to have. And that's important because these high school girls help me as assistant instructors and assistant coaches for the other youth teams that I coach. I coach a U8 and a U10 co-ed teams. And I use my players to help teach them the skills, but also to develop leadership in my players. So this is going to be central to the kind of a relationship that we have in the course of the year. And this is part of a larger discussion about leadership and the relationships and voluntary transactions between people and whatever they're doing. So you could substitute the word player for trader and get the same discussion. You could substitute the word player for Army officer or Army leader and change the word coach to professor or whatever, or business owner and employee, or anybody that you're in a relationship, any relationship that you could define. You could write it in the form of, hey, what are my expectations and what are my desired qualities and how well am I manifesting those qualities in the, so as a coach, am I really manifesting the kinds of qualities that would attract the kind of player that I want to attract? And so there is a synergy, there's a mutual reinforcement in here. So the reason I say all this is to say the following, that it's my position that the way you learn best is by becoming a teacher, because it forces you to look at the material through many different eyes, not just your eyes and how you learn, but through the eyes of others. And so in that multi-dimensional look, you end up seeing more nuance about the game, the trade, whatever it is that you're doing, and it makes you a student of the skill, of the craft, of trading. And that it's a well-known saying that if you want to learn something, try to teach it some. We're seeing a lot of evidence of that already this past year through the way we're doing the hybrid trading and the small learning groups. And so I'm really excited to see what the girls are going to come up with on Monday. But I posted a couple things in the on Patreon and in the chat room today that addresses this directly. So one of the traders sent me a question that said, hey Ken, now that I've mastered the kata number 1, he didn't say master, he said he had successfully completed kata number 1, and he was interested in expanding now to collapsing dragon and emerging dragon. Now this is a trader that's only been doing this for a couple of weeks and hasn't even been through the hybrid course, and so he asked a fair question, and that is, how do I set the initial stop for the collapsing dragon and emerging dragon, and asked me an innocent question. So naturally, me being me, I turned that into an elaborate answer about learning how to fish. And so the best way to acquire the knowledge that of whatever knowledge, if I have any knowledge that is of worth to you, if you want to get the fastest transfer of knowledge, skill, and experience, it's to do the following. When you ask me a question like that, you don't get to stop thinking. That's when you then ask, well, how do I think Ken is going to answer that question? So that makes you think like a coach or think like the teacher. What's he likely to say and why? So that makes you do some reflective double loop learning. And I say, let me try to anticipate the way I think he's going to answer that question. And then write it down and commit to it. Get skin in the game. Then when I give you the answer that I'm going to give you, you can compare my answer to your answer and see and compare and contrast. And in that analytical review, you are going to advance in your understanding by leaps and bounds over asking a question and waiting for an answer. In fact, I have a little teaching contract of sorts with my students. They're all senior captains, and so they have been direct action leaders, and they come to this school to learn how to be organizational leaders, how to be field grade officers in charge of 1,500 or 2,000 people, or commanders of large units, or working on a big staff. And they have to be independent staff officers to sort through pretty complicated problems. And nobody has time for a field grade officer to come up and ask them basic factual questions. I expect them to be independent and innovative in working through the problem and answering their own questions as much as they can and putting it all together. And when they don't know, to go conduct some research. You don't come back to your boss and keep asking him questions that you can answer if you just put your mind to it. So I have a contract with them which says if they're going to ask me a question, they have to also suggest how they think I'm going to answer it and why, as a check on learning to see if they're actually thinking the way I think and not just trying to wait for me to tell them what I know. That's not helping them at all. I told them I already know this stuff. I don't have. And the way I learned it was by working through it, not by somebody telling me, but I proofed it myself, and then verified and validated and checked with others. But after I'd done the due diligence. So we also have a contract that when it comes to doing our large exercises where we're running simulations and different groups of people are representing different headquarters, so we're working off a operations order and a plan, and we want to ask higher headquarters if they will give us more assets, or we have it's called an RFI, a request for information, where you don't know something and you want the higher headquarters to give an opinion or say, hey, I want you to send me some more artillery so that I can have more combat power. And then we send that request to higher to see if that'll solve a problem. Because we're asking for more artillery because we've done our analysis and we don't think we have enough to handle the mission that we have at an acceptable level of risk. So we're going to ask them to give us more of their assets. So I tell them, look, when you ask higher headquarters for that, that's legit, but it's going to take them 12 hours to answer that question. So when you brief the commander that, hey, the status of our request is that we asked them for more artillery and we're just waiting for them to tell us, that's not good enough. You actually have to say, imagine that you were on the receiving end of this request for additional assets and put yourself in that guy's position, and then look at the doctrinal answer of what are they likely to say when they ask you for that answer, and then what's the worst thing that they could say, and what's the expected thing they could say, and what would be the best possible answer and why, so that we can decide whether or not it's reasonable to expect them to give us the extra assets instead of just waiting 12 hours and hoping. No, we're actually going to look at the different answers they might give us, and then what would we do if they give us the answer of no? So we're not waiting for them to tell us. We're actually taking a look at our request and evaluating it. So that's how you learn to develop the skills of an organizational leader, or someone who's working at a higher level of complexity, is when you come up with what you think is a good question, ask the question, but also prepare what you think they're going to say so that you can check on your own level of learning. So when I post that question in Patreon today, it was with an invitation to you guys to say, hey, how would you answer his question about where to place the initial stop on a collapsing dragon and an emerging dragon? Well, that's asking you to see through the eyes of a coach. How would you answer that question if you were trying to teach somebody? And why would you say that? And what's the justification? And how does that justification connect to the larger body of knowledge? That's how you can check back to that ecosystem, that body of knowledge, to see if you're able to reason things and you're able to think like a problem solver instead of a problem identifier. You know, your job is to keep going and to ask one more question or to add one more thing to it. So my answer to him on that question was, in the usual way, I asked him another question right back. I said, well, I understand your question. What I want you to do is take a look at a couple chart samples, come up with where you think I'm going to tell you to put that stop. And so he did. He came back and said, well, I think my initial plan will be to put it at this location. And then I said, well, I'll get to that in a second. Well, let's just go ahead. Let's just go there right now, because we're too far to stop now. Yeah, here was the question that he asked me. How do I handle stop placement for a collapsing dragon and an emerging dragon? And I said, hey, put your answer in the comments on Patreon and I'll discuss it tonight if there are 5 answers. And hint, those of you that ever asked me a question before, you kind of already know what I'm going to say. You know, this is not a surprise to you. So some time passed and he came back to me and said, well, and I thought this was pretty good. My initial inclination is the initial stop should be at the peak of the RL10 hump and then trail with the Bollinger Band mean once the Bollinger Band mean gets to the entry, which is like the Wu Wei exit. That's a really good answer. Except it's not the best answer. So the subject of this lesson now is how to develop a course of action that you can recommend to others for them to take on a risk based on your recommendation. And this has really powerful implications for impulse control. So here's how this thing goes. When you're briefing a commander about a course of action or a recommendation, you're asking him to take your professional opinion and then make a decision that's going to commit people's lives to his decision. You're asking him to make life and death decisions on other people based on what you're telling him he ought to do. That is a very serious position to be in. So when I'm ready to make a recommendation on a course of action as a trader or as a coach of traders, I'm ready to describe that course of action to you when I'm ready to commit to it with money. And that level of commitment and that level of due diligence is different than the first inclination. And if Robert Gardner were still with us, he would say that's a tell. That's the words that I picked up on in his answer to me. He said, after I asked him to come back with what he would recommend or what he thinks I'm going to say, he said, well, my initial inclination is that the initial stop should be here. Notice the meaning of that phrase, first inclination. Here's what I hear. The first inclination is a tentative response that hasn't been thought through completely, definitively to a conclusion yet. It's just the first obvious urge. Well, the first thing that came into my head was this, so I'm just going to tell you what was the first thing on my mind. Well, that's what herd animals do because, well, maybe it's good enough. So it's like a knee-jerk reaction, and then they just do it. That's what herd animals do. And apex predators make a living on herd animals that act on their first instinct, that fight or flight syndrome, to act without thinking. Apex predators make a living on herd animals that think that way. So if you don't want to be a herd animal, then what you got to do is you got to develop the idea until you are ready to commit to it. What do you mean commit to it? I mean you're ready to put money on it. It's even more than that. If somebody that trusted you asked you your opinion on what to do, and then you gave them your recommendation, and you knew that they were going to put their money on the line because they trusted your recommendation, what would that do to you and the way you think your way through your recommendation? I think if you're a mammal, and if you're the kind of person that's still listening to this, you're the kind of person that's going to do your due diligence and not ask them to take a risk that wasn't fully developed, that take a recommendation that didn't have due diligence. You're asking them to put skin in the game on the basis of their trust in you. That's a pretty sacred responsibility. So I would tell you that the first inclination is not good enough. The tentative response is not good enough if you're going to make unless you label it as such. You say, hey, this is just the first thing. So that's fair. So if it's not a recommendation or it's not a definitive position, then you got to label it in such a way that it's absolutely clear what it is that you're telling them. Hey, this is just the first thing that came to my mind. I'm not saying do that or anything like that. So all the the caveats. But what we're trying to do is this up here: how to develop a course of action that you can recommend to others for them to take a risk based on your recommendation. So when you are ready to commit to your recommendation or to your answer, that's what that feels like, is that you've done your due diligence and you've given them the risk, but you said, yeah, I've thought it through. This is what I think. So let's call that course of action 1. So when he asks me that question, it's not good enough to say, here's my first inclination. We got to move on to where if you didn't tell me anything, here's how I was going to act on it because I've thought my way through it, and here's the best idea I can come up with. So the first one you come up with that can stand that level of scrutiny, that standard of being legit to recommend to others, course of action 1, your job is to come up with 3 courses of action, then compare to each one to that level, and then compare and contrast them against a set of evaluation criteria to decide which of those 3 thoughtful, deliberate courses of action are actually the best, all things considered. Then you can make a decision. So you detect. Now let's look at how this little process connects to the way we think about trading. Detect, decide, deliver, assess. That's the D3A. The first thing is I detect an opportunity. Well, I have an opportunity to trade a collapsing dragon, and I got to decide how to place the initial stop so that I can deliver the entry and then assess and manage the trade. So that decision on where to place the initial risk matters because it's all part of this D3A. And then this is all also connected to plan, prepare, execute, and assess. I'm planning on where to put that initial stop. Well, what I told him was that he's got to take his first intention, his first inclination, which is pretty good, by the way, fully develop it to the point where he could actually recommend it to others, then develop 2 more courses of action to be able to compare and contrast. To fully understand your recommendation, it means you had to consider a couple other legit choices and then decide why yours was a better reward to risk ratio. So if you're going to compare 3 things, what you have to do is define your evaluation criteria first so that you can fairly compare those, because otherwise you'll commit the following crime. What guys that are first learning how to do this end up doing is something like this. Well, here's what I really want to do, course of action 1, but my coach or my boss or Ken is going to require me to give a couple other courses of action. So I really know what I want to do. Let me just BS my way and put a couple other things in there, and then it'll be clear the one that I want is really better, and then he'll pick the one that I really want. Well, that's a lie by omission. So the first thing we got to do so that we don't fall victim, we don't fall in love with our first idea, is that we develop our evaluation criteria first. So here's how you do that. You answer these questions. Hey, what matters to you when you're establishing an initial stop? What's important about the initial stop? Well, let's take a look at a functional question. What does the initial stop have to do? Now, here's how you sharpen that tool. Hey, imagine you were going to hire the initial stop as a reliable worker. How would you describe the job description for the worker that you're trying to? I want to hire somebody to do my initial stop, and they have to have these qualities. Well, suppose a bunch of people came in to apply for that job. How would you decide among a pool of applicants who show up for the first job? First come, first serve? Or would you have some way of comparing and contrasting? How about something like this? One course of action is I'll just use one frog box for the following reasons, blah, blah, blah. Hey, I'm going to use half of an ATR, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to use the hump of the dragon for the reasons, blah, blah, blah. Well, those are three legitimate answers. I could understand why you could come up with that. So how am I going to pick and choose between three pretty good answers? Well, that's where I need evaluation criteria. So I got to define those first before I develop those courses of action so that it's fair. I'm judging them against something like an objective standard, which is, what does the initial stop have to do? Well, maybe it's something like this. I'm going to ask you to figure it out, but here's a way to get you started. It has to be close enough so that I don't lose too much money waiting for the trade to be invalidated. It has to be far enough away so that normal noise that doesn't invalidate the signal doesn't take me out of the position. So in other words, it has to be in a location where I'm sure enough that the initial hypothesis of the trade is going to fail that I can legitimately say this experiment didn't work. So I got to have confidence that, and I don't need to go and then add extra insurance and all that, but I got to be confident enough that the hypothesis is invalidated, but not so close that simple noise gets me out. And there may be some other reasons, but that's all the initial stop has to do, is to tell me if this thing is failing right away. That's all. Then I can use that information to manage the size of the position based on some other factors. But that's all it has to do. Now, what the trader gave me was then he gave me another follow-on, which was telling me how he was going to manage that trade afterwards. But that is, I want you to realize, that's a separate issue of how to manage the trade after it is successful to some degree. So all he's got to do is think of what the initial stop is supposed to do, what's its purpose, and then and only then can I tell you where you ought to put that initial stop. Because I have an opinion about what I want the initial stop to do for me, but it's really important for him to say, what am I looking for in an initial stop? Not just so he can answer that question for the collapsing dragon and the emerging dragon, but when he starts modifying the rule sets of the kata, and he starts trying to figure out how to maybe modify the initial risk, he's got to know how to make that decision and how to ask those questions. So I'm teaching him to fish. So here's the key insight of this first half hour. When you are considering whether or not to act on a hunch or not, think about this. Ask yourself this question. When you think that you're ready to act, would I recommend this course of action to someone if they were going to trust me with their lives and money? Would I? Or am I just going to give them a hunch? Is my hunch good enough to them risk their lives on it? Think about it this way. What if somebody knew that you were a trader and they came and talked to you and they said, hey, what should I do with my money? And they're asking you for a recommendation, and you're ready to tell them something. Am I committed enough to this idea that I'm willing to let an informed friend or family member take that risk that is embedded in my advice? What do I owe them for due diligence before I make a recommendation? So I'm pretty sure that you can answer that question, but here is the most important insight. This is how you manage your monkey. Apply this same kind of rigorous loving kindness to yourself. So when you find yourself in the trade and things aren't going well, whatever, and you just say, screw it, I'm just going to take this next one and I hope that's going to work. That's a hunch or a prayer or a hope or a dream or a gamble, or you've given up. Would you tell somebody else to do that? You would not. So give yourself the same kind of rigorous loving kindness to make sure that you only act on the basis of due diligence and respect for others. Give yourself the same kind of courtesy and care that you would give to others. Act on things with commitment after you have done your due diligence. And do that for yourself. Nobody else is going to do that for you, by the way. They figure you're a big boy and girl. You know what you're doing. So act like it. So if you wouldn't recommend for somebody else to do it, don't you do it. And use that to help your fireman discipline that chimpanzee that says with desperation, I got to get in, just don't do that. Act with rigorous, loving kindness for yourself, the same way that you would act for others. Do the due diligence. Or just act on impulse and be a herd animal and get eaten by apex predators. It's your choice. Now, I'm not trying to be mean and vicious here. This was really a good question. How do I handle stop placement for a CD or an ED? Now, I don't know if he's done the due diligence or not when he asked me that question. I just took this as an opportunity to help him see through the eyes of a coach. And I'll tell you, every time you guys ask me my opinion about something or how do I do it, I go through this kind of mental self-flagellation because I know there's a good chance that you may be acting because of trust in my recommendations. I'm always mindful of that. And so I try to be as careful as I can in my answers. And I know that you are responsible for your results and that you own those decisions and that you're taking my commentary with a grain of salt. You should. But even so, I still feel that connection to the words that I say. So I want you to start thinking like a coach so that you can raise your game when it comes to the way that you play the game. If you can learn to look at your own behaviors through that coach's lens, think twice, act once, then you are moving along the path towards intentional action, towards management of your monkey mind, not just knee-jerk responding to everything, but what would my coach say if he saw me about ready to do this thing? If you can put that wedge in between the trigger to act and the impulse to act and the decision to act, then you're good to go. You are thinking like a coach, a player coach, a player, and you'll be in a position to be able to give insights to other people in your small working group when you start acting like a peer instructor and start teaching each other. So all you ever got to do is testify to what it is that you know and how much confidence you have in it and the justification for believing in that way. All we're looking for are truth tellers with transparency and the honesty to say what I know and what I don't know, and the courage to offer what you know with the limits on what you think you know. Then we can actually start building these things together. Your point 2 and my point 2 plus point 4 of our courage gets us to the point 8 solution, which we can tentatively offer to others. Say, hey, this is just version 0.8. So, let your conscience be your guide and let the buyer beware. Not claiming anything beyond the fact that it's version 0.8, but it's not nothing. It's something. So we can start acting in a measured way to manage the uncertainty that is the standard work environment of the trading arena. That's always what it feels like. So if you're going to go into that arena, you better have a plan that has been prepared and trained in execution and continuous assessment. But know that you step into the boxing ring, you're going to get hit. You're trying to hit, but you're going to get hit. So you got to be able to deal with the ebbs and flows of the daily trade. And you're going to feel inclinations to do things, to act on impulse. How do you prevent the chimp from winning? He weighs 600 pounds. He's a gorilla, for crying out loud. The fireman has to have some skills that allow us to manage that chimp. The chimp does a lot of good things for us. It gives us that emotional energy to take things in the first place, to be even willing to take risks for the potential reward. But he's not a great thinker. And his hands are a little clumsy. He doesn't have fine motor control, and he doesn't have the ability to imagine alternate futures and weigh different courses of action and to manage impulses and to defer gratification. That's what separates our species from chimpanzees. But we share a lot of that same DNA. So I say all that to say simply that give yourself the same kind of rigorous loving kindness. Rigorous, I mean due diligence and sharing with others. Rigorous loving kindness for yourself that you would give to others. Be gentle in that, but be firm. Act with commitment when it's time, when you've done your due diligence. Don't be a herd animal. Or just be a herd animal, whatever you're going to do. I trust you to make that decision. That was all triggered by Ken Hum, who in our collaborations has formalized the Wu Wei exit and shown us how to do it. We call it the Wu Wei exit because it actually solves the problem of, should I be a sniper or should I be a manager? Should I be taking my impulsive profits when I feel I should? Or should I just follow the disciplined rules of the manager no matter what? That creates tension and anxiety and cognitive dissonance all the time unless you have a way to resolve that. So the Wu Wei exit is simply a way that we say, hey, if it's gotten that far, give half to the sniper, half to the manager. That's the wisdom of King Solomon. And split the difference. And now all the tension is resolved. And then each half only has to do what it does. And then we'll take the average of that exit and we'll be happy with that. Because we decided that that was justice, that that was wisdom, and that we were seeking for a wise, low cost, low cognitive energy system that would allow us to study the results and then to refine the sniper and the manager rules in their own dimension without trying to pick which one was the best one of all time. That's certainly going to get you to regret. So the Wu Wei exit, as described by Ken Hum, shows us the way to do it with effortless action. So now here's my challenge. And I sent this over to Tharpland to see if they want to talk about that. Would you describe your exit management system as effortless? So I then asked Ken to describe the learning ecosystem. Now, Ken Hum is an old hand at this. He's been around for years. I think he would tell you that what we've been doing in the last year or so, last year or two, this evolving ecosystem is a breakthrough in the way that we're getting it done. So he described the learning ecosystem that we use as, and I couldn't say it any better than this, as a modern day digital apprenticeship, offering through an immersive experience in the trade, the integration and synergy of a philosophy, but also a process of learning and improving by doing, with the mindset and the decision-making skills, with methods and tools that allows a community to train together, do the work, learn for and with one another, to build discipline, internalize and solidify the skills, to grow the standard individually and as a community of practice. Bam. Bam. I couldn't change a single word. I couldn't add a word to make it better or delete one word to make it better. That's just what it is. And I want you to notice he's pretty slick. He has picked up on the idea of the reinforcing hypnotic effect of bolding words in order to lock it in. So, with that in mind, that's what led me to say, how do you think I'm going to answer this question? How do I handle stop placement of a CD or an ED with a new trader who has completed kata number 1? He's trading successfully after 3 weeks just by working on the supported spring crossing without any other encumbrance or diversions. And so his question was, now that he's ready to do collapsing dragons and emerging dragons, how do I handle the stop placement? The way I handle it is what's taken me now an hour to talk my way through. How to think like a coach, how to answer your own question, how to learn the skills of due diligence. It's not enough for me to say, hey, well, what do you think it ought to be? No, that's not fair. So I've got to provide a recipe, a process, some guidance on how to think about answering that question and all future questions. So this is what I mean by due diligence and developing a course of action, and then how to compare them. And I gave you 3 possible answers for what you might consider. And then for each and every person that has that question, don't you imagine that there's really an answer that's best for them based on their circumstance? We talked about that yesterday, that in the world of self, system, and market, that when you're looking to adapt a system for a market to yourself, most of the variables have to do with you and your skill level, your objectives, your confidence, your risk reward profile, the amount of time that you have available, the markets you like to trade, the other things you got going on, what your objectives for results need to be. All of those things go into the fine-tuning of a strategy, which is 80% of the idea. You got to fine-tune that final 20% to make it your own, and most of those variables come from inside the self dimension, which is why psychology is so important. You know, psychology is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. That makes all the difference. The lightning bug has a point of view, has a perspective. Lightning just happens to be what it is. Psychology is the difference. Hat tip to Mark Twain. I hadn't initially planned on doing that for the first hour, but that's kind of where we ended up. So this coach and player dynamic then, ask the question of yourself and in all things. How do you want to coach? Or who do you want to coach? Let me put it that way. And I would say, if you are a coach, how do you want to coach? What kind of a coach do you want to be for others? What would that job description look like? What would the job description look like for the coach that you want to coach you? If I'm not that person, then if you give me feedback, I may be able to be that person for you if it fits with how I want to coach. It probably does. So the player's feedback helps the coach become a better coach. The coach helps the player become a better player based on his knowledge and skills and measurables and all that stuff. But that reciprocal feedback loop is what makes this really powerful. And if we're sharing goals and a path forward, we can learn how to see like a coach and how to speak like a coach. So I hope to have given you in that first hour is how a coach thinks about answering questions that players bring. So when my Army officers bring me a question, I used to have very junior officers and say, hey, sir, how should we handle this problem? And my question to them was, it wasn't even a question, was turn around, leave my office, come back with the Army regulation that governs this problem. And the Army has a way of solving routine problems. So you tell me what the Army's system is for handling that problem and what the regulation says we ought to do about it. And then you take into account our situation, and then you tell me what you want me to do with that problem. Then I'll listen to your recommendation. And if it's a good recommendation, in the future, you don't even have to ask me. You can just do it. And oh, by the way, do that for all problems that you're going to come to me with. Because you know that's how I'm going to answer the question, guys. I'm going to say, well, what does the regulation say? And if you don't even know what the regulation says, you better not walk into my office if you're an Army officer that works for me. If you're a trader, that's different. I'm not going to treat you quite the same way. But that's sort of the same principle. That's how I was training those young lieutenants to become good captains and majors, is by learning how to think about standard Army processes. So what we've just engaged in here is sort of what I would call a story circle. And it has a past, a present, and a future. And inside that story circle, people of goodwill come together to rest, recover, relate, repair, repurpose, all of the R's in the middle. And so when you come into the story circle, you're bringing something, and it's purpose, principles, values, identities, roots, all the things you're grounded in, plus your experiences. And then you're bringing into that story circle something that you're planning on saying. You know, it's kind of rooted in the past and your experience and all that stuff. And then in the present moment, when the story is being told, something magical and dynamic happens, that in the interplay between the storyteller and the story listener and the story itself takes on a dynamic quality that surprises everybody with the creativity and the reality of what just happened. You never tell the same story twice. You never step in the same river twice. So there's something that happens kind of in this present moment between the story, the audience, the whole team, and the storyteller. And this is an open-ended circle, because as this story is unfolding, new things are coming in and some things are leaving, and this is not completely planned if it's live and dynamic. And at some point, when that story circle is adjourned, the future holds something like, what do the people take with them? And where does that story go? And what does it do? And how does it morph based on their experiences wherever they go? And how does it replicate in other story circles? And when they come back and tell their story about that story in our next round, you get this notion that in the roundabouts, that walking man that comes in with head, heart, gut, hands, and feet, the 5 locations of knowing, that we have new things to say, and then as we say them, they take on a life of their own, which goes beyond our imagination, usually. And that's why things like Ken Hum's treatment of the Wu Wei experience and exit management turns into such a powerful tool of collaboration and synergy that's the effect of the learning ecosystem that he was describing. So the reason we tell these stories and share our experiences is because we never really know how people are going to receive it and where they're going to go and develop it and go further, but we're open to the possibility. And as long as we're kind of united in these purposes, principles, values, identity, and these deep roots and mutual support, integrity, honesty, transparency, sharing, selfless service to others, in pursuit of R that can then be spent on things that will improve the world, well, that's a pretty virtuous story circle that we're involved in. That's what I want to say about that.
Okay.
Thank you for your indulgence and your patience. So we've got